back to Deep Thoughts in this really weird episode. We're going to have some fun here. How to build a UFO. Doesn't that sound just crazy? Well, I'm going to show you where I got the idea. Now, what's weird is, before I found this book in my collection and really went through it, which I've had for 20 years, I used to do this all the time. And it's one of the things I actually recommend you do, because it's a lot of fun, if you're into science and that sort of thing, which is to sit around and try to design things that obviously would make no sense for you to be doing based on your life and your career. Like, you could do motherships, you could do submarines, you can do whatever, because you'll find out that half the time you've got solutions for things that no one else has solutions for. It's really weird. It's like the spirits of the universe channel through you as soon as you open up your mind and go somewhere that no one's gone, right? But a buddy of mine bought a book for me as a gag. And sort of a gag and sort of not. You guys know by now, you'll be able to attest to this. But it's called the Anti-Gravity Handbook. Just like that. The sticker on the back says $4.95. I believe he got it for me in the mid-90s. And probably damn near 10 years or 20 years to the time we're at right now. And what's funny is he really usurps in the cover here, because he republishes some of the greats in their writings. He credits on the front Nikola Tesla, Albert Einstein, talk about oil and water, Arthur C. Clarke, the writer of 2001: A Space Odyssey, and 2010, 3001, NASA, UFOs, and much, much more. It's sort of what it's about, but it's sort of when you go through the credits on, it's pretty funny. So you get into this, and he starts talking about sort of all the low-hanging fruit of power sources, of what, I mean, look at this. It's got a big picture of the Tesla coil in it, right? The big one he started building in 1917. He goes through a lot of the pictures of Mars, which look nothing like, what NASA says they look like, which is pretty funny. But he goes through a lot of the UFO pictures. There's pictures of 1999, the show, in here, with Lithgow in here. But every single disc-shaped craft that the Air Force has created, and etc. And then he starts kind of going through, almost like some of these guys on the internet that go through, UFO designs, like Bob Lazar, and they say, "Oh, no, that's the X-21. This is what's inside." And they start showing like these almost Forbidden Planet-looking interiors to these ships, right? And so I thought, let's do an episode on like, how would you make a UFO, and what are the actual requirements to our UFO, right? I cut my hair, and it's going to look like shit for a couple months, but it's my once-a-year cut. So when you think about creating a UFO, and I don't, I'm saying create a UFO, which is really talking about creating someone else's alien vehicle. What I'm really talking about is you want to create an interstellar craft that can get from our planet to another planet, right? There's so many requirements that man doesn't really think about in terms of the just average conversation across the dinner table or at a bar or something like that. And I'm sure the aviation groups that have contemplated this, like a NASA group, what have you, to the best of their ability, at times have thought this thing through. We're gonna lay it on the line right now. I'm going to give you an interesting analogy as to the difference in how we would design a UFO or design an interstellar ship. I'm calling the episode How to Build a UFO. Someone use the word UFO. Screw all those people. As soon as our ship is seen by the universe, they're going to be like, we couldn't identify it. So therefore, we're going to build a UFO. Now, when the event 9/11 happened, you have these two buildings in New York that are struck by two jets. At least that's how the story went. And that's what we saw on television, right? We saw this video of the famous, second tower being slammed on all these different angles. And then someone thought, let me talk to some pilots and ask them, how fast can a jet travel at sea level, right? Which is where that second plane was, and pretty much the first plane. For those of you who don't realize, 1,100 feet up is pretty much sea level compared to 30,000 feet up. Essentially almost 30 times as high, right? Well, the guy just calls all these pilots on the phone. He says, well, how fast can the plane go? Especially 757. And all these pilots said, about 270 nautical miles, per hour. And that's airspeed miles, whatever the hell they call them, right? And the guy's like, well, because he's talking about 9/11 in his brain, because we're told that that second jet, just look at it on video, it's coming in at like 480 to 500 something miles an hour on all the videos, right? And so every pilot he called, he could call like 10 pilots and recorded his conversations and put it on the internet. Every single one of them was about 270 miles an hour. And he said, well, no, wait a minute. I know that's what you would do because you're a commercial pilot and nobody flies, no one buzzes the tower in a commercial jet. But he goes, what if you wanted to go 500 miles an hour? And all these pilots are like, you can't. You can't. The air is too thick. You can't push a plane that fast. And he goes, well, what if you just dump the throttles? He goes, you'd rip the wings off. It's just basic, aviation knowledge. And so he doesn't argue with them at all. He just says, thank you so much for that information. And then he puts the two together and goes, look, we've been shown these videos about a plane that can go through oxygen, the thick oxygen, at 450 to 550 miles an hour. And he goes, this moment could not have occurred in physics because of what these pilots are telling us. No matter if it dropped out of the sky or whatever, just start ripping the wings off the second it dropped through the sky because the air is so thick. Now, I gave you that little analogy. One, because I want you to start questioning that information. But two, I think that when I hear about how to build a UFO or how to build an interstellar spaceship, I only get the conversation about the propulsion system. How many times has Bob Lazar been interviewed, and the only thing they're asking him is, well, how do you move that fast? How do they get to us, sort of thing. And his thing is very specific. His story, just so some of you can come up to date. Bob Lazar is this guy that I think it was like the late 80s, early 90s. I heard about this guy after his story had already kind of run its course, so I don't remember all the details of exactly when, but he comes to, put it this way, he's a physicist, supposedly goes to all these colleges. These colleges say they've never seen the guy before. And he gets a job working at Area 51, which is the coveted what the hell do they call it? Groom Lake, New Mexico area. And he says that he did so well so quickly that he was bused down to the other facility south of there called S. And he says that he was ushered into a warehouse. He said there were 9 crashed or shot down UFOs. He was brought to a disc one that looked pristine. He said, I believe he said the one that he worked on had no damage on it. That he crawls inside of it, and he starts describing the interior cockpit built for small people, all this kind of stuff. But down in the lower chamber, there are these hanging antimatter engines, and they're kind of like barrels, like really small barrels. And I believe the configuration he gave us was 3, but I think I've seen configurations up to like, half a dozen. But he said the theory of these antimatter engines is that they hang and they'll turn in unison together, like this, like those hanging, I don't know if you guys are on audio, I'm not sure how to make sure you see this, but they essentially hang from a hook at the top of the motor that intentionally kind of leans them left and right, forward, back, all directions from hanging from this hook. And that it projects a gravity well in front of the vehicle, which for me is it is literally displacing the ether in front of the ship, creating a void, and then you get pulled into the void, which is what gravity is, and then you just propel yourself around the universe, right? So what Bob did, just to kind of recap real quickly, is that he had shown his buddy John Lear, the descendant of the Learjet Company, which there was a big headquarters in Wichita, Kansas, where I used to sow my oats. And he had shown him some test flights at Area 51 from a vantage point that he could see. They got in trouble, and I think that the story goes is that Bob essentially tried to bring in a news reporter to say, okay, I need you to know that I work here, so I'm going to take you to all the declassified areas that I can, which is not on Area 51 or S4, but something like Kirkland Air Force Base or something. Dragged this reporter through on a guest pass, and he said, all these dudes work for Area 51 too. Why don't you go say hi to them and ask them questions to prove that I am or who I say I am. The guy does it, he confirms, and then Bob gets fired. And I can't remember I've heard the story told a couple times, and one of them is like Bob got captured the night that he showed John Lear the test flights, and so there wouldn't have been a time for him to go get a reporter. So maybe he was brewing this for a little while. But anyway, the interesting thing is that when Bob Lazar is questioned about the propulsion systems, he's got a fairly decent story. It does look hokey as hell. This antimatter hanging antimatter engine thing. It just looks fake as hell. I mean, I don't know. It just seems like it's a little moving parts and quirkiness, I would imagine that you could create a gravity well with electromagnetism without creating any sort of moving part, when you look at old record players and you see this giant slab of wax and it's rotating, and then you look at a memory stick. I was in the middle of the 80s, and once I understood memory, I went and told my parents I had this dream of a memory stick, because there was also carts inside of Atari 2600s, and so you could see that you could imprint on a memory chip a game. So I said, look, these two things need to be combined so we can store music on here, so there's no moving parts. Just read a digital file, right? Lo and behold, someone else had the same great idea and more engineering power than I did at 15, and created like MP3 kind of technology. It's fantastic. But I think that the first thing that is sort of misunderstood about UFOs, is that there's a fabric of the universe that you need to deal with. There are various densities of energy that you have to deal with. And let me give you an example. When it rains, we never, most of us don't like getting wet, just like a dog. And so sometimes we'll jump out in the rain, and it'll be raining, and then we start running through the rain because we don't want to get wet. And we're in our brain, we're going to be in the rain less amount of time, so we will get less wet. And I've read these studies my entire life. It'll show up in some weird little column. The Omni magazine back in the day, which I seriously miss that rag. They had red pages and they had silver pages inside the magazine. So it was like these little brief little sections. I believe they called it, one of them section was called the Continuum. And you read these little tiny little articles, and they were just utterly brilliant. Some of these little articles changed my life, and they all turned out to be true in most cases. I mean, if it wasn't true, it was just irrelevant. But one of the studies this guy did was whether or not you actually do go through the rain. If you run through the rain, do you get less wet? And I think the calculation was slightly yes, like just 3% less or something like that if you're lucky. Of course, if you get stuck at the door wherever the hell you're headed because it's locked, and then the awning is dropping more water on you because you're stuck at the edge of the house, you'll get actually wetter, right? But now imagine all these problems that we know about that keep NASA from doing any type of interplanetary travel. Now, again, if you believe everything that NASA does, well, this probably isn't your show. You probably should find at least a few other episodes first, like episode 26, the moon hoax. We're going to have a Mars mission hoax video coming out as well before this one, probably. But here at MK Ultra, we are absolutely certain that NASA has lied about absolutely everything, because NASA has failed to prove most of the things that they say, and they hide everything. But we know that by my education from NASA, scientists who've worked there 20 years plus, they told me that the ambient radiation from the sun is so intense that we can't withstand it with our current technology. We have to build something special. That's not counting the Van Allen belts, which are extremely volatile. Because now, let me throw this at you too. we know that there's a Van Allen belts around Earth. Can you imagine the Van Allen belts around the sun? How massive those things are, how absolutely formidable those things are. And hell, who knows how far out they would go from the 93 million mile point of the center of the sun. What if the whole thing's a hoax? What if the Van Allen belts are a big hoax too? Okay, so we have regular radiation from any type of sun object in the galaxy / the universe. Okay, so you have a lot of that going on. Then you have the magnetic poles that emit from the center of these magnetic spinning balls, which are planets and suns. Okay, and for those of you who are new, we believe that the center of the sun, the center of the earth, and the center of all moons is electric, all right, and largely hollow, but it's full of plasma energy. Eventually, I'm going to do an episode on the moon, but just as a little cheat, anytime the moon gets hit by massive debris, NASA and most of the engineers who listen to it say it rings like a bell. It rings like a bell because it's hollow, because it's got an electrical interior just like Earth, just like the sun. The sun is black on the top as soon as it starts blowing out a bunch of CMEs because it's hollow. All right, don't let that disturb you. There's absolutely nothing wrong with an electrical ball that has a burning surface on the outside. I don't know why anyone would get all pissed off that you're only pissed off at your 6th grade teacher who told you it was a hydrogen ball burning or something like that, right? Or high school teacher, depending on whenever you got that knowledge. Big deal. It's made us something different than you thought it was. Nickel interiors and hydrogen interiors make no sense for what we're actually seeing in the universe. But when you string the whole thing together with electricity as being the probably the first visible energy that you can see, besides perhaps a photon, which again, it's all the same stuff, right? But it ties together when you make it electricity. The galaxy spins like an electrical vortex. The burning stuff on the outside of the sun behaves like a stuff burning on the outside of an electrical ball. It's like, relax. It's cool if you have any issues with that. So we have ambient radiation, okay, from just all things. Then we have the Van Allen belts around every single one of these things. So essentially the magnetic poles around every large body. All right. We got to steer clear of this stuff, or we have to deal with it. Then we have flying debris. And the majority of it is little tiny specks of debris. And sometimes it's a gigantic, small planetoid of debris. So we got to watch out for that too. And unlike, planes in the sky that have a red light on the left and a green light on the right to tell you what orientation is it coming at you, is it going away? Asteroids don't have any flags on them and headlights. And they don't announce themselves before they exist, before they come into your proxy. They're just there, and they're hauling ass. So in Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry sort of thought this through, and a little bit. And he created a deflector array, which, if you have the Star Trek Enterprise, you got the disc on top, which is pretty much the living quarters with the tin forward and the bridge. Then you have this long neck that goes down to this big body, which is sort of where engineering is and a lot of other living quarters. But on the front of that body is this deflector dish with this little pinpoint on the front. And of course it comes up to the nacelles, and you have the warp nacelles, which actually create the warp drive, right? Well, Gene was smart enough to say, okay, not only do we need shields, but we need a deflector array. And I'm not sure, deflector sounds dangerous, right? Imagine you're flying your ass off through space and you're deflecting gigantic meteorites in different trajectories, and maybe some planetoids have figured out how to put, a comet in a certain orbit so it doesn't hit their planet. And here comes the Star Trek Enterprise and deflects it right into their planet, right? But at least he dealt with it. He put a deflector array on the front to say, okay, as we're going warp speed, you got to deflect stuff out of the way. You got to neutralize it, turn it into energy, whatever you got to do. Of course, the giant problem is you wouldn't have enough energy to deflect a meteorite the size of your ship, or 10 times the size of your ship. It would take a little while, and it would take a ton of energy. And then what do you do with that energy once you convert it? because it's gonna explode if you don't carefully get rid of it, right? And since you can't hide energy in the universe, you would have to divert it somewhere. You can't divert it into the nacelles because you'd fry them. You can't just let it blow up in space because it would be an explosion in front of you. So big problems there. And there's comets and there's meteorites and comets. So meteorites would be essentially the more primitive, iron rock or something flowing through space. Who knows? Now, for some of you who believe in black holes, well, I can tell you that we, here on Earth, the folks that aren't trying to make money from black holes anymore, they have decided that black holes can't exist. They would come together and diffuse very quickly. It doesn't mean there can't be a construct that diverts light, that diverts photons away from where it should go, and then when you look at it, it's a little bit darker or it is black. And maybe the light's just being turned left. Who knows? But I think that just to say, okay, we're going to create ourselves a UFO, and the number one problem is propulsion. I'd say if I said, here's a light speed drive, here's your warp drive, you would be stuck on Earth still, because you're going to need to come up with all the techniques to get around this other material in space. And that's just what we know is out there. There could be other things out there. There could be a void of the fabric of the universe. And the only thing we can hope is that, let's just say that you had one of Einstein's, space-time fabric pool tables, right? Where he's got the ball in the center that all kind of cones down into this kind of warpy center, right? And you could take they had this ball and they threw it on the table and it would circle around and kind of go down into this orbit until it hit the center object, right? And that was the proof that his ideas were right. Pool tabletop. Okay. Imagine that the pool tabletop simply didn't exist for a round portion of the table. Just randomly on the table, just draw a circle. And you say right there is no space-time fabric. For whatever reason, it's just not there. And here comes your planetoid trying to do in this little Einstein circle. Now, does it go around that? Is there a natural path to say, mass can't exist there, so we're going to go around that little thing and come around the corner? Or does it go right into the void and cease to exist? Mass can't, / energy can't hide in the universe, so what would happen? Would it dismantle? Would it fray like the edge of a sweater? Who knows, right? So because we don't really have any knowledge about traveling in space, there's unknowns out there, right? All right, but we're going to go ahead and start with propulsion, because that's the number one thing. I think that one of the silliest things that man has done, and it's actually romantic and interesting, is that as soon as you go back to Buck Rogers days in the 1930s in Hollywood, based on short stories that were written about Buck Rogers first, comic books and that kind of stuff, you have rocket ships with rocket engines, right? And so you have these tapered fuselages, which are built for Earth travel, because you have thick oxygen you have to punch through, and a bullet shape's perfect. And then you had, the rocket thrust coming out of the back, because that's how we built the first rockets, right? All right. Makes sense. But when you think about that, and most of you know already that you're essentially trying to push off an atmosphere, you're trying to push off the surface of the Earth. That's what these engines would need to do in order to, based on their design, that's what they need to do to kind of lift off. Once you get into space, you have nothing to really push off of anymore. It's all relative. You could have an engine sitting in the center of space in a vacuum, and it's firing away, and it's just staying in the exact same spot because there's nothing to push off of. That's why I think books like this, right, anti-gravity books, come out, because they're like, okay, we need to really grip on, just like grabbing a hold of something, we really need to grip onto the fabric of the universe to move around. We just have to. Because we're talking about moving around the universe, not just moving around the atmospheric cloud that is around Earth. The atmosphere on Earth is as thick as the paint on a basketball. I got a friend of mine who keeps posting these fake animations from NASA where the atmosphere of the Earth looks like it's 6 inches thick on a 10-inch ball. He's just so enamored because for him it's real and it's the image he's always wanted in his life, but it's fake as hell, I watched this for 2 years and finally just had to call it out in New Year's. It's like, dude, this is fake, right? the shape of the continents isn't, the Peterson projection map has proven that that the continents aren't shaped like all the globes you have in your schools and libraries. So when NASA comes out with the fake globe animation where all the continents match everything in these globes, we know it's fake. And the atmosphere is super duper thin. What's up with this super thick atmosphere you got? And the whole thing was to hate man. Was the video. It was like, look how overpopulated the world is because lights are there. And it's like, okay, it's a fake curvature of the Earth for one thing, which condenses the population down to make it look like we're a Borg planet, right? But it's just, people are just, man, they're so easily manipulated, man. To hate our own race. Take yourself out in the woods, put the 22 in your mouth, and pull the fucking trigger already, right? Because it just can't get any worse than it is right now, right? Like, spare us your fucking loathing of mankind. Take yourself out first if that's how you fucking feel, right? Sorry to get all emotional on you, but I just find that it takes a special person to hate mankind, to hate the whole fucking race, right? It's like, what's the deal, man? We're talking about UFOs, and I'm going off on a social digression. So your physicists will jump in really quickly because they need to protect their big boy Einstein, who, it's really funny. If any one of you have seen Peter Sellers' movie Being There, which I'm sure most of you haven't, the movie's about a guy who's just an absolute moron who walks around the universe and he walks around our, United States of America. I think he becomes the president of the United States, I think. But he's a simple-minded guy. And he's picked to be the president because all the presidents are puppets, right? And so he's just totally out of the way. But he says these sort of like nice, profound statements. And, he doesn't contribute to any policy of any kind. But it's sort of like the cat, Lord, in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. This guy talks to his cat to figure out how to run the whole universe, to run the whole galaxy. And was it Zani Woob is trying to find the guy who runs the universe? And it's a similar situation. But when I think about Einstein and how absolutely dysfunctional this human being was, I feel like he was no one, and I feel like they just kept superposing on the guy all these different theories and saying, look how smart that guy looks. Now he did give lectures and stuff like that, so that's a bit of a stretch, but yeah, it's just interesting. But as I've said in many episodes, E equals MC squared when you put in the velocity of light. And the E equals MC squared is the simplified version of his master algorithm. And so when you bring back the master algorithm and you put the speed of light in, trying to move one particle in the universe, you get this divide by zero because you have, the theory is that you have to, and this is a ridiculous theory, right? That somehow the speed of light is some utter magical principle. And completely synthesized in man's mind, just so you know, right? They've arbitrarily picked the speed of light as this unbelievable threshold of reality, right? It has to do with the velocity that you have to move subatomic matter to create fission and blah, blah, blah. So the theory is, I think, complete bullshit, but it says that the entire universe has to push one particle to get it to go the speed of light. And let me just shake this out of your head for the first and last time, okay? You can see me because there's light in the universe. What? But according to Einstein, none of the light that you're using right now to see your car if you're driving and you're listening to the iPod or if you're watching YouTube, none of this light could exist if Einstein was remotely correct. Because the whole universe would have to push one photon. Oh, my Lord. Some asshole will split the atom and say, well, a photon doesn't have mass, and so it doesn't go into the formula. Really? Energy is mass, mass is energy. Again, these guys rotted your brain when they told you this crap. So if you're a scientist having fun with this video, you just need to flush E equals MC squared. Just flush it, right? It's all about locking your brain into this world in a way that you can't escape. Because you think you can't travel the speed of light. Or you're often you just start off with your heart, stabbed in terms of being able to pull off any of this stuff. Well, they say you can't. Well, I know you can't through conventional means, so I got to think up some folding space thing. All right, folding space is going to folding space has a gigantic appeal to it for some reasons we're going to get into. Now, again, there's experiments you can do in your house. If you look at Eric Dollard's old experiments in the 80s, I think if you search on Eric with a C, Dollard, Dollard, and you look up his club that they made in the 80s where they videotaped all their experiments, and I think if you just search on Eric Dollard's speed of light or something like that, he has an experiment where he hooks these circuits together with the voltage meter and some other software, and he shows you that by just configuring circuits on a kitchen table, right, or a little workshop table down in this basement, 3 guys were able to get electrons to move 3 times the speed of light right in front of your face. I think it's like 3.5 times the speed of light right in front of your face. It made the trip 3.5 times faster than the speed of light just with normal little circuits downstairs. Tesla and Faraday both tracked the ether of the universe traveling 50 times the speed of light. So, I mean, it's ridiculous to think we can't do it. Now, it doesn't mean it's going to be an easy way to travel, all right? But the reason why I think that anti-gravity always goes with UFOs is that it's not just simply because it's a cool thing to have. It's literally the only propulsion system that would survive all the mediums of the universe itself, right? Because a rocket engine is only going to work really well on a close atmosphere here on Earth, right? So you need something to be able to grip into the bowels of the universe's fabric and move you around. That's where anti-gravity comes in. Now, the big question is what is gravity for most of you? And a lot of you are still towing, again, more crappy physics. We have no idea what gravity is. Okay. I'm going to put up an image. It's going to also be in the Sacred Geometry video, which is gravity is made possible by something called ether. And if you are a physicist, you will have been told very early in your life, in a very nonchalant, probably one-sentence description, that ether doesn't exist. And it's because it's the magical key for you figuring out how the universe is actually working. The ether is a wind that moves in all directions all the time. It's the most ambient thing out there, right? When 2 bodies of mass are close to each other, the reason why they attract to each other is not because they're exchanging gravitons or they have some weird, ecosystem of electricity moving through them and sucking them together. All right. It's because there's a negative pressure between the 2 of them because they're getting hit on the back sides just as much as getting hit on the front until something obstructs the front. So my analogy is always the same. You're with your buddy in the park. You are 100 feet away from each other on a really windy day, and you still have as much wind on the front as you do on your back. As you both start walking towards each other, your backs start blocking the pressure on your front. Eventually, you create a negative pressure between the 2 of you at maybe 6 inches or so. You can really feel it. You've done this a million times with your lover in a parking lot when it's really cold outside. You put your coats together and you get in there and you modulate your body heat together. But before you get to that, one of the reasons why you can modulate the heat between you is because you're blocking the wind around you. That's a negative pressure. That's how wings lift planes into the sky, right? It's the shape of the wing. The air goes quicker over the top than over the bottom of the wing, and that creates negative pressure because it's moving more of it out of the way, right? Maybe it's the opposite. I apologize. So that's what ether is. So if you want anti-gravity, you must create an ether-blocking engine. Well, electromagnetism, because ether is part of the fabric, the ether is made of the smallest unit of energy that comprises fabric of the universe. You can call it space-time fabric if you want. The problem with putting a term from Einstein's camp on top of the ether camp is that he couldn't figure out what ether was, and so in order to keep himself looking smart, he just simply said it didn't exist. We have some stupid experiments. Faraday, the godfather of all electricity, is like he believed in ether till the day he died, but he couldn't figure out what it was, and he goes, look, I'm just going to move on with life. He said, I don't have to understand why a steak dinner tastes so good to enjoy it. So he said, I don't have to understand what ether is. But electromagnetism is working within, it's using the same exact, you could call it atomic matter, okay, that ether is made out of. But atomic matter as we know it, electron, proton, neutron, that sort of thing, it's a higher level creation using this fabric. So they're compatible in talking to each other, and they're compatible in colliding with each other, right? For those of you who are really deep in physics, what you need to consider is that the center of an atom could have nothing more than a photon. And that when ether, a much smaller object, bounces into and hits this photon, and it's just, again, it's an orbital pattern of energy being discharged, right? A photon always having velocity, always having movement, because it is the verb of reaction over the fabric of the universe, right? It isn't an entity in itself. It is merely a disturbance in the configuration of the fabric itself, right? Once more ether bangs into that and moves off, you could have essentially your dielectric path is one of the bounces, and one of the orbital paths is your electron path. When the two bang into each other, you have electromagnetism. It's all the same thing, but you're just essentially classifying the behaviors and their velocity and trajectories to give it its own unique behaviors. And because we can use those unique behaviors to our advantage to power valence on a piece of conductive metal, it is good that we call these things different things, but they're all exactly the same thing. Right? It's like a little kid that builds something out of Play-Doh. All he has is a big pile of the same colored Play-Doh. But if he builds a little sprocket or a wrench or a tire, he's going to say, that's a tire, that's a wrench, that's my person's head that I created. It's all the same stuff. But once you move it into a shape, you have something that you can call, it's a higher construct, as I always say on the show. Okay. So in order to create a gravity, anti-gravity system, we need a lot of power, and we need to disrupt the permeability of an object to make it weightless. What does that mean? Well, it goes something like this. Remember the old analogy I just gave of you? It's not that old. It's waning a little. The analogy of you and your friend in a park, right? And you're blocking the wind from your buddy's face, creating that negative pressure. Now, what if I could modulate your friend's body such that they're damn near translucent and transparent and permeable, meaning things can go through your friend? Your friend's okay, but I've just simply made it so that atomic mass, the wind behind him, can go through him. When all of a sudden you're getting hit in the face with the wind that he was blocking, or she's blocking. All right, well then you no longer have that void between the two of you. You no longer have the attraction between the two of you. So if you modulate mass in a certain way, you can probably create a bit of permeability with ether, letting ether go through you without disturbing your makeup, without disturbing what you are. Or hell, maybe it kills you. I don't know. But if we're dealing with sort of inert matter, doesn't have a living being in it, right? If we say, look, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to shield and deflect ether off the top part of my ship so that it can immediately lift up, then perhaps you're just creating a gravity well above your ship. But maybe you let it go through your ship. Who knows, right? But we need to engage and grip, just like an eagle claw, into the fabric of the universe and start creating these negative pockets to create this void, which is sort of what Bob Lazar's talking about with these antimatter engines, although he doesn't believe in any of his lectures acknowledge the existence of ether. Even though a gravity well, especially a gravity well, the concept of a gravity well without an ethereal description doesn't make any sense at all. You're going into more fictitious classifications of what you're doing without actually talking about the fabric of what you're doing it in, So we start to need some system by which we can create electromagnetic poles and guide them, right? Now, the first problem is the power source. What do you do to create a power source for a ship like that? Well, the first hurdle of mankind is that we've allowed bankers to destroy every zero-point energy technique in the universe that we've ever had access to. But luckily, Tesla has started to make sort of a comeback. There's a renaissance of Tesla's paperwork of what he was doing. And he worked with the ether. That's what his whole system, his laboratory had no wires because he was working with ethereal sources of energy, which were his Tesla coils. Now, for those of you who don't know, Tesla coils have been re-engineered in the eyes of man to be the inverse of what they actually were. The Tesla coil works in both directions. Now, let's say you take a certain unit of electricity and you move it on a wire, point A to point B. Obviously, the wire is going to eat up a little bit of electricity, so you don't have quite 100% at the other side, but it's close. Now you take that wire and you coil it on top of itself one turn, and you send it to the destination. And all of a sudden, you get a little more electricity. You've amplified it up. You jacked it up. Now take a Tesla coil, which is a sort of a conical tower of coil, all the way up, thousands of rotations of this wire, all the way to the top of a ball that's very, very conductive, right? Well, that's the way that we actually have it in the books today. Is you put a little bit of power at the bottom, it coils all the way to the top, and then zaps off the top. You have this lightning bolt, and that's the way college students play songs on them now when they play Jingle Bells and Iron Maiden on them. What they were really designed to do is the absolute inverse. That ball on the top was designed to collide with ethereal winds, which is a very low amount of electrical stimulation. Take that tiny, minute amount of electricity and coil it down into the bottom of the bowels of this machine. There's a couple different designs at that point. One of the Tesla coil test he did in Colorado was he took that infinitesimal amount of electricity and shoved it into the earth. And then the earth provided infinite electricity out, which is where you get the Colorado test, where you have these massive lightning bolts that you see. Again, he put almost nothing in the ground and got a standing light bulb for 16 seconds. A lightning bolt for 60 seconds. Can you imagine? His big antenna that he was building from 1917 to 1927 was all about building a gigantic ball in the sky, Tesla coiling the whole thing down, coiling it all up, and having an aqua ravine down below, just like the pyramids, which is also bringing the bowels of Earth's electrical core up, and then mixing the two together and getting infinite power that then he was going to broadcast to everyone's home in a low frequency that wouldn't hurt any human DNA or mitochondria, and then reconstitute it exactly at the machine that needed the electricity. This is exactly how he ran his laboratory for 30 years before he was going to give it to everybody. But the bankers found out and had it torn down. Then they sold the AC motor to everybody. The reason why I tell you that story is that it's polluted your brain for how we create a propulsion system, a power system for an anti-gravity engine. We're thinking, well, you got to burn coal, you got to have a fission reaction in the middle of this thing. There's no zero-point energy theory in your brain to start the process out with. There are zero-point energy systems. The ether is massive. You could capacitate it and coil it up into larger and larger quantities of power. So the center of our spaceship is going to have to be something that works with the ethereal winds. Then the more gravity you have pulling on your ship, the more that you can use that gravity to well into the center of your engine a power source, right? Now the Disclosure Project run by Dr. Stephen Greer, again, he comes with 4 or 5 asterisks to his name because we think he works for the government, but there are these electromagnetic wheels that people create that, electromagnetism does affect ethereal winds. And so when you take a bunch of magnets and you put them in opposing configurations in a wheel, you do get a point where you can create this well of ether down through the center. And when you harvest it properly, you get this amazing result, right? The whole flying saucer shape is actually extremely intuitive when you need to start creating these I guess you could call it gravity well engines, because you need essentially a donut. Yes, it is like the Iron Man power source. I think that Iron Man, in the first episode, had a gigantic plasma version of what he built in the cave, which became his chest plate, power source, right? It is like a donut. You have this outer pole, which is sort of what you've gathered, but at the same time, you have the electromagnetic mechanisms, whether you build it out of magnets or out of circuitry, and you're sucking things through the center, creating zero-point energy. Again, the whole universe survives on electricity second to second, minute to minute, day to day, right? But there's no one out there shoveling coal into the center of the sun, and it's not a hydrogen ball. The one reason why we know it's not a hydrogen ball, besides looking into it when it has a coronal mass ejection and seeing its black interior, people just look at those photographs and they don't think twice about what they're seeing. It's like, oh, really? It's full of hydrogen and helium being about 40% of it, right? But down inside the center, it's black? Yeah. It's because the gravity is really light in the center, right? It wouldn't be blowing up in the center, right? It would, right? It'd be blowing up more in the center than on the edges. The edges should be the coolest part of the sun, and the interior should be the hottest if it's a gravity ball of hydrogen helium. But what do we know? We know that just by observing light from the sun, it's relatively, non-combusting a few miles down. You've got, a couple thousand degrees, just a few miles down on the surface of the sun. But the surface is like 10 million degrees. That's an electromagnetic plasma ball. That's exactly what would happen if you were to attract, the subatomic matter to the outside and fission this crap together and create all kinds of stuff, right? You'd fission together through gravity, electrical stimulation, hydrogen and helium as almost a frequency that exudes off the sun, and then it would combust into fission. So you have this fusion-fission relationship around the surface of the sun. Every once in a while, it creates a little burned-off pocket because it's ejected some of it out because it's starting to kind of pop some of its ethereal winds, right? We endorse ether. We go after some of these zero-point energy systems, and we manage to create, we usurp one of the configurations of these electromagnetic wheels, right? Again, the Coral Castle guy had a little tiny wheel in his warehouse, and we believe that it was his entire power source for everything that he did, because according to the locals, he didn't have a power bill because he didn't have a power company line to his house. He had power to his Coral Castle way before there was any power brought into his area. Talk about 1915. Bringing electricity into his place. It was a field in the middle of nowhere where he's stacking gigantic 60-ton rocks of coral. So he'd go into his little warehouse and he'd spin this wheel, and the electromagnetic wheel would grab ethereal winds, and it would capacitate up electricity, and he would use it to do whatever he needed to do, move his rocks, So once we have the zero-point energy system, I'm just going to leap right through that because we'd have to do a whole hour on every single theory of how this works. We now have the ability to disturb the ethereal winds around this vehicle and start moving it. Now let's say we just do a minor experiment here on Earth, right? We're able to get the vehicle to lift off and come back down and move left and right. So we start figuring out how to modulate probably the sacred geometry of this frequency to start creating, disproportional waves in it to move it in a particular direction, right? Leans a little bit forward to teardrop. Well, there goes the ship in that direction. Pull back the algorithm and lean it back the other way. Okay. So there's got to be some modulation of this massive field of electromagnetism to get this thing to work. I think we can figure it out. We start lifting off, going through the atmosphere of Earth, which for the most part is pretty friendly, right? Well, let's get through the Van Allen belts first, because once we get through the Van Allen belts, we're doing pretty good. We're going to have to get rid of these colliding things out there, which I'm going to have to get pretty creative on this show on the fly here. Well, we know that the Van Allen belts are made of essentially the classification of mass and energy that is known as electrons. Very volatile stuff. Again, if the astronauts were to ever go through the Van Allen belts in a quarter-inch capsule of aluminum, they'd be cooked just like a piece of steel in your microwave. It'd be horrid. They would die instantaneously and of savagely being boiled and carbonized. The whole vehicle itself would probably vaporize just by the sheer stimulation. It would just be like a ball of energy just going pop, and they'd all die. So how is our ship going to pull this off? Our ship's still made of probably some metal of some sort. How are we going to pull this off? All right. Here's an idea from yours truly that I haven't heard discussed out there. There's something called the Faraday cage. The Faraday cage works on the principle of a fairly steady current of electricity hitting a mesh of steel. Electricity has a tension, if you will, just like the tension of water. You see those little bugs that skip on the surface of a pond, right? Well, they're working obviously with the tension of water at the top, and their little legs cannot break that tension. Well, it's sort of the same theory of the principle of the way the electrons move over surfaces. And as long as the frequency is steady, you can build a cage, and you can put your arms on the inside of the cage, literally your forearms on the inside of the same steel dowels, and this electricity will hit that cage. And because at a certain density of chicken wire, you won't crawl inside this structure. And the reason, is that the cage itself is formed of energy in its own realm. It's just slow-moving energy, which we would call mass, right? So you have fast-moving energy made of the same exact stuff that interacts with its brothers, and it goes, okay, I'm gonna glide on the outside as opposed to go inside you. Every brother should ask permission to go inside another brother. Let me tell you. What if we were to take the surface of our ship and at some nano level create a Faraday fabric as our outer coating of our ship? So if you were to zoom into our fabric of our spaceship, one, we'd probably want to make it of the most resilient metal we could possibly find, right? Unobtainium. But as we configure the atomic matter to be the outside surface of our ship, we configure it in a way that we keep most of the common frequencies, which I don't know if the Van Allen belts have a common frequency. I would imagine that the altitude of your penetration of the Van Allen belts might actually vary in frequency, but perhaps the frequency varies slow enough that we could actually still have the Faraday effect on the outside of our ship. So we've convinced all the electrons that would normally bake us and kill us and penetrate our ship and boil our mitochondria and cook us like a microwave, right? We convince it to stay on the outside of our ship. Now, instantaneously, if you're a physicist, you might start thinking, well, geez, man, the friction alone might still cook your ship, no matter how hot the metal was when you made it in the foundry on Earth. You might instantaneously eclipse the melting rate of your metal, and you're still going to boil because the thermal cloud around your ship might just get so warm you'll just cook the ship. Okay, so we couldn't possibly allow it to just remain on the outside of our ship. They look very, very bright. We see these UFOs that go up in the sky and they get really bright and they zip away, right? Now, there's two things that we can do with that electricity. We can divert it, or we can consume it. Now, when we see UFOs, what we think are UFOs, that travel in threes especially, there's all these videos of them, whatever the hell they are. Could be plasma balls. But as soon as they reach it, and they're not up at the Van Allen belt layer, okay? But as soon as we start hitting this massive amount of electrons, maybe we just turn our engines up to ludicrous level and we push through them very, very quickly. Now, pushing through comes with friction as well, right? But perhaps we move congruently with the actual force, the vector of force that the Van Allen belts are traveling at. What does that mean? Well, you know that if you stood in a raging river and you just stepped right in front of the river and you're like, I'm not moving anywhere, the river's going to knock you on your ass. You're going to be like the Hulk to not be knocked on your ass. But if you were to swim with the current of the river, then all of a sudden you have it at your back and you're moving really, really fast. Surfers know all about this, right? When a surfer gets hit by a wave, they get their ass handed to them. But if you hop on your board and ride the wave, oh my God, you were going nothing a second ago, and now you're going 30 miles an hour pretty much instantaneously. When I catch a wave, oh my God, it just hurls you. It's the most amazing thing. It's one of the most beautiful things about the whole experience, right? So perhaps we know where the North Pole is of our heliocentric ball. We know the South Pole, and we simply get up there and we ride the wave. We ride it, and then we, just like in a river, when you're trying to escape being killed in a river, little advice from a lifeguard, you swim diagonally with the current towards the coast. So it's going to be pushing you beautifully, so you maintain control. Your relative speed to the water rushing is now going to zero because you're moving the same as the wave itself, and you get to just do a little guide to yourself off to the side of the coast, and you'll be okay. It doesn't really work for ocean waves that are pulling you out to sea. You got to be very careful about how that works. Basically, if you don't have a massive upper body strength, don't try to tangle with the ocean. It will wring you out like an old dirty rag and kill you. So we start hitting the Van Allen belts. Our Faraday fabric on the outside starts to divert the electricity. If we don't get our engines moving very, very quickly, our little ethereal gravity well algorithm to start pulling us in the direction of the ether will cook. because we either have to spin the energy. We could say capacitate the energy, but I think that that's sort of a given that at the level of Van Allen belts, we probably couldn't capacitate that energy. I mean, it just means store it up. Or we would fire the inside of our ship, because if you probably have to store it on the inside, and then you would overdo your capacitors and you'd explode, right? So we're going to have to either divert this stuff off the top, which is going to be a fair amount of the, hopefully the theory of this Faraday fabric, or we're going to have to spin it to get going to the same velocity of this fabric, and then hopefully in the 25,000 miles thick that we think the Van Allen belts are, we have to guide through just like escaping a river and swim to the edge of its 26,000 mile up average height, and then we punch out of the Van Allen belts, and now we're going to be really hauling ass. For one thing, we're still going to be grabbed by the gravity well of the Earth and every other celestial body out there, but at least we'll have some momentum to make some decisions. And various levels of escaping this cloud, we could capacitate up our maximum capacity inside the ship that we could then use when we don't have that level of free electrons or free power to move through space. Now, the good news is that the sun puts off a tremendous amount of the same energy, and the ether is always there. So in terms of moving after we get to the Van Allen belts, we now have a very productive level of ethereal winds that we can harvest into movement algorithms around the universe with our gravity well machine. The big question is, if you were to be able to metabolize all the electrons in space to create some capacitated motor, right, some zero-point energy motor to create these gravity wells, how fast does a gravity well let you travel? That's something we will have to find out at some future point. The fantasy would be that it would turn into a warp engine. You would have, in having a void in front of your ship, in whatever direction you want to travel, the ship will tip into that void and really make it, if you keep simulating the void in front of you, that you start to move very, very quickly. But now remember all that space debris we talked about. Space debris is terrifying, okay? As I said in a previous episode, which should have aired before this one airs, you look at these rail guns that the Navy have created using electromagnetism. They take these ceramic pucks, and they fire them through big slabs of lead and steel, and it just liquefies the living shit out of them in split seconds, right? That's what happens when you move a little bit of mass really, really fast. And so, the reason why a lot of people have a problem with the space station existing, even in low orbit, is that when space debris hits the space station, it would rip it inside out. You take a BB, all right, and I throw it at you with my hands. I throw it at you as hard as I possibly can. I'll be able to create probably a little bruise on your flesh. Put it in a BB gun, now it goes into your flesh. But now I move at 35,000 miles an hour to 135,000 miles an hour. Who knows how fast this stuff can travel in space, right? Now I'm turning your body inside out with the BB. It literally inverts your body. You're gone instantaneously, right? So when the space station's up there floating around for years and years and years, it's going to get pummeled by this stuff moving that fast, right? The Van Allen belts they do an amazing job. They as a single object, but it does an amazing job boiling this stuff away. So a lot of the little tiny debris gets boiled away by this cloud around us. Thank God, right? But as soon as we leave the Van Allen belts, whatever the algorithm is for how much hits Earth is a big gravity well in itself. We're not going to be the big gravity well in space. Probably even if we create these little gravity wells in front of our ship, we're not going to be creating any massive trajectory change for anything, because we're only creating the minimum amount of gravity well in front of our ship to actually pull it forward. Who knows how big that needs to be, right? Do you create a big gravity well and then you start moving faster and faster and faster? I would imagine we need a massive amount of electricity to create a massive gravity well. Technically speaking, if you had a massive engine that was very, very efficient, I wouldn't say massive as in size, but it's able to metabolize a lot of this ethereal winds and electricity in general, electromagnetism. that you could create a gravity well as big as Earth in front of your ship. And boy, would you start screaming through space, right? But you'd also start moving everything towards that gravity well. And so as you would be pulling your ship forward, you'd be yanking all the debris into that hole, which would be essentially vacuuming everything into your face. A little bit of a problem there, right? How do we avoid debris in space? Well, I think that the poetic thing is you create a well. We would have to create a gravity bubble around our ship. The displacement of ether around our ship to pull it through space would have to have a very interesting shape. The shape would have to be bigger than our ship. The shape would have to be so big that as a projectile is coming straight at the hull of our ship, there's a gravity well much bigger than our ship. The pear-shaped gravity well is going to put the pear has got a big fat base, right? So if the fat base goes out in front of where we actually want to travel in space, it's because it's disproportionately going to pull us in that direction, right? It's where the most of the void is. But the well around our ship's going to have to exist in a fairly decent distance away from our ship. As a projectile comes to our ship, we're going to have to convince it through gravity to avoid our ship. It's going to come in and get yanked around our ship. Hopefully it's going to come down, enter the gravity well, start curving the gravity well, and maybe we can actually manipulate, the vector of where things are to make sure that the stuff actually travels around our ship. Seems like a stretch for something going extremely fast, but that's how we'd have to do it. Or we have to create our own Van Allen belts around us that would fry everything the second it got close to us. The challenge would be the mathematics of creating a field that is capable of vaporizing a certain size rock, a certain size of debris. We'd have to make sure that the rock, its composition, its melting point, was addressed in our wave around our ship if we're going to try to fry everything just like the Van Allen belts do for Earth, right? Either we move it out of the way or we vaporize it as it hits us or tries to hit us, right? Now, the nice thing is if we could figure that out, if we say, okay, well, most things are solid iron in space, but if the supernovas really exist and they're creating these massively dense elements elements in space, we may not know our periodic table of metals and materials in the universe may be drastically incomplete. So we may run into stuff that's actually in a pure form that then gets disintegrated when it tries to hit Earth. So we've never found it on the surface of Earth because the Van Allen belts takes a compound, a nuclear compound, and splits it out into its elements, and we only find the elements. Who knows? But there definitely would be a threshold of how big an object could be to be moved around our ship and vaporized when it came towards our ship. So at some point, we're going to have to create some mechanism by which we can view ahead of our ship what the hell we might be impacting, right? And then we're going to have to move around it in a way that we don't feel any type of disturbing movement inside, right? Now, there's something called inertia. Inertia is obviously the natural resistance of one energy base on another energy base. You want to move in a direction, and this mass says, no, thank you. You can't go past me. This is Monty Python said, no, none shall pass, right? In Star Trek, they've created this beautiful thing called inertial dampers. And what that really means is if you take the shuttlecraft and you all of a sudden move at light speed, it's pretty stationary in space, and now it's going the speed of light or more. Even impulse power, which is sublight speed. You have to encapsulate this ship in inertial dampers, some mechanism by which the occupants inside never feel the velocity change in space. And it's only relative to what would be pushing on your body to make you feel like you weren't moving, right? Now, we have oxygen on Earth and that kind of thing, so when you sit inside a roller coaster and it's jamming at you, you're bumping into oxygen, you're bumping into the gravitational force of Earth, and so you really feel this need for an inertial damper. If an elevator were to move you 300 miles an hour straight up, it'd probably crush you. Just instantaneously be human pate on the bottom of the elevator by the time it came at the top. But once you remove a lot of that relative gravity around your ship, we might be able to deal with what's left fairly easily. But here's the thing. if we're able to disturb the ether of space, right, then we probably have already simultaneously discovered the technology to create an inertial damper, because we've taken all the relative mass that we're pushing on our body to make us feel like we're going in any one direction, and we'd be moving at the exact same rate instantaneously. So if the cockpit, the bridge of your ship, and all of its oxygen and all of its mass were to move instantaneously at the speed of light, you as well would be within that chamber and be able to move whatever speed that is. Now, the other thing is that the E equals mc squared does pose a bit of a threat if it has merit to it, which, again, we believe, since we've created fission with plutonium and TNT, which is probably like C5 at this point, right? We think that once you move mass, right, it really is, what is it, the mass times the speed of light squared sort of thing, that it converts back into energy. Like, it simply can't hang on to itself in its native form if it's moved too quickly. So the idea is that, again, they've told us that once you get over the hump of this idea that every particle in the universe has to push a single photon, otherwise a photon can't exist. Obviously, we see photons, so that can't be true. That if we move our ship really, really fast, then we ourselves convert back into pure energy. So we'd have to run some tests to figure out what's actually going to happen the faster and faster that we go. We don't have any visual evidence that things move in space that quickly, except for quasars. Quasars, if they truly exist as observed, the redshift of a quasar is really, really puzzling. We've got quasars we believe are moving, when they did this expanding universe idea, they still think these quasars are moving in particular directions twice the speed of light, and there's still these big giant celestial bodies. So hopefully that's true, and that's a sign that we can move our ship really, really fast without vaporizing into pure energy, right? But the other question is as long as we can, even if we did move into a fairly energy-based form, can we maintain our form as we slow down? Is it merely just the visual impression of the mass as we move faster? Maybe we look like we're more made of energy, but then when we slow back down, we coalesce back into what we are. We don't lose our nuclear bonds, and we don't fission into a gigantic nuclear explosion, right? There was a beautiful... and I can't even believe this. It was 1956 when the movie Forbidden Planet came out. And if you haven't seen the film, you must see the film. All right, it is where Gene Roddenberry got his idea for the Star Trek Enterprise, where you have a ship's captain, the science officer, and a doctor all going out to see what's going on this planet. But here's the thing: at the beginning of the movie, you'll see this very quickly. You'll see it in probably the first 5 minutes. Once Leslie Nielsen, who we know as a comedian in my era, he's passed on now, but genius guy. He does a beautiful job acting in this film. And the film's got some goofy stuff in it too, which is funny, but it's mostly science fiction. They have to hyperspace for one of their last leaps in this journey to this planet that these colonists disappeared. They just want to know what happened to the colonists. And they all have to stand on these these sort of Star Trek transporter pods. It's where the transporter technology, not for point A to point B transferring, but to actually stand on a pod that was going to modulate the pattern of man. But they all rush to get in their little pods, their little round circles, discs on the ground. And there's a disc in the ceiling, right? So it's modulating between the two discs. And what this technology was theorized to do in 1956, when the movie released, which means that the idea had been in people's brains for probably 20 years, is that they're going to move the ship so quickly that the mass of man could not handle the movement. So instead of creating an inertial damper, they simply modulated man's body into a pure energy form, moved the ship really fast, and then reconstituted man back into its slower moving form, which is mass, right? Brilliant little thing they did. Maybe there's some actual life-imitating art truth to that particular methodology. That somehow when we want to move really, really fast, we simply modulate our bodies into this pure energy form, which is less combative with the movement of the ship. So let's say that we've done a couple things. Now let's take some inventory of what we've been able to theorize, very loosely, of course. We've been able to establish a anti-gravity engine. We've been able to establish a zero-point energy system. We've been able to deal with the unbelievable force of a Van Allen belt around any celestial body. We've been able to harvest the natural emissions from every sun. We've been able to get rid of small colliding bodies through either diverting them or vaporizing them. We're able to, just like a radar, we're able to send out a beam of energy that can view ahead of us and see big objects that we actually need to move around because we can't possibly vaporize them, and we shouldn't, because maybe it'll hit another planet and kill people, right? Again, diverting material in space could be a very interesting liability. Again, if you're, it's just like the, the butterfly in Peru changes the price of tea in China sort of thing. You might cause an effect that's tremendously going to hurt other people. Like Arthur Dent saying, I seem to be having a particular problem with my lifestyle, right? For those of you Douglas Adams, you'll get that reference. But what if we're pretty good at that point? We're pretty good at that point. So what would be the ecosystem of our engine at that point? Well, we might be able just to harvest the ethereal winds out of the universe and capacitate them up and coil them up just like a Tesla coil. You notice I've stayed away from antimatter. Antimatter would be antimatter could be a mechanism by which we could take the low amount of energy that we have, capacity up into a massive amount of energy, and create these particles known as antimatter. Which antimatter is, as far as I've been able to assess, is a fairly theoretical idea at this point. But, I first bumped into antimatter when studying black holes back in the 80s and 90s. And, you essentially have a particle in the universe that is in such a state that when you convert it back into matter, there's a massive amount of energy that is constantly created by creating antimatter and using it up. Once you have antimatter, you can bring it back into this universe and bring it back into this state that we know as the mass that we interact with, and constantly crossing back and forth between these two event horizons between the two of them. You can harvest a tremendous amount of energy doing this. I'm just going to leave that off to the side because I don't know that we need it. And if you had it, then great. You're just going to take everything we've talked about and make it slightly easier to accomplish, right? We do have this theoretical particle called a tachyon. And, Star Trek really is a science fiction-based series. And so when the layman hears tachyon inside Star Trek, they're like, oh, they just created this particle. Well, tachyon is a theoretical particle that can't move slower than the speed of light. It is stuck on the other side of the event horizon of the speed of light. If we could tap into some sort of tachyon current and control it, then a couple things become amazingly capable, right? One, we have essentially a mechanism where you could create a tachyon communications protocol where we could be millions of light years away from Earth, but because a tachyon can move the distance between wherever we are and Earth, we could figure out where the hell it was in space. We could say, we're okay. How you doing? Hey, Mom, look, no hands, right? And the tachyon would be able to get it to us, and we could catch it and then modulate it back into some frequency we could translate into video or audio, right? Well, we could also use such a particle to figure out what's way ahead of us. We could also use that particle to probably map the universe, to be honest. Almost just like a sonar maps the bottom of the ocean. We could map the entire universe, at least in some field of view in front of us, some frustrum in front of our ship, wherever we're looking. We could see where things are, right? So the other one is we could use every celestial body in space as a mechanism of sort of slingshotting our velocity. If we didn't have infinite power that we need from the ethereal winds, we could kind of plan a waypoint mechanism to say, okay, we're out of Earth's gravitational force. We're going to slingshot past the sun, which is going to give us a massive burst of energy. We're going to stay way away from it so we don't get burned up by its thermals. And then we'll slingshot off of Jupiter, off of Neptune, and then we're just hauling ass in one particular direction towards Alpha Centauri. At that point, we may just have enough velocity that as long as we can steer around objects, again, we're going to be surprised at the problem, right? So what we're going to have to say is, the velocity that we're traveling is going to have to see something ahead, and we're going to have to curve our trajectory and not bump into something else. So we're going to have a pretty literal translation of what's in front of us to not hit things. Again, I haven't talked about folding space yet, right? Now, folding space, because we've pretty much exhausted straight line travel in this discussion. Folding space is very alluring, right? The first time I ever heard about folding space was in the book Dune. And it really is, for any of you who've played War with a piece of paper, I don't know if you guys ever did this, you get a piece of 8x10 paper, you fold it in half, lengthwise. One half is your buddy's army, the other half is your army. And you have so many ships and tanks and whatever you want to do. It's going to be sort of an artillery game. You draw your ships with a number 2 pencil, right? And he draws his units, you draw your units. You typically try to draw them sort of in the kind of the nebulous area of the center paper so no one can use the reference of the edge of the paper to figure out how to fire on you. But what ends up happening is you draw when you want to fire on your buddy's piece of paper on the other side, you take the piece of paper and you draw a circle of a lot of number 2 lead. You make like about a 1/4 inch circle, right? Then you fold the piece of paper over, and it's really the trajectory of this artillery shell coming over. And you fold it over, and then you draw on the back of the piece of paper, transferring the number 2 lead to the other side of your buddy's piece of paper. Then you pull the paper back, and you see how close you hit the unit. And just like Battleship, eventually when you hit the unit, even just a little bit, it's blown up. It's totally blown up. And you can make little sub-rules and saying, well, if you don't hit it completely, it's partly damaged. Trust me, it's easier just to say if you hit it, you hit it. Well, that is sort of a from-to concept of folding space, that we don't travel the distance in between. We merely take our signature of our energy and we somehow get it to show up at the other side of the universe. And there's some interesting things that Stephen King did in his short story, which I can't remember the name of it, but I believe it was the Bachman books. I'll just mention it right now. I think Stephen King wrote under a pen name called the Bachman books, Bachman. It's where I believe some of his creep show stories came from. It's where Rage came from, Burning Man, not Burning Man, The Long Walk, and Running Man came from. Those 3 stories came from the Bachman books. But he did one, I believe it's a tiny, like 22-page short story about a guy who created a teleportation machine. It was essentially like a metal detector doorway. And whatever you put through the doorway would teleport across the room 10 feet and come out the other doorway. And it was, it's a man's fantasy to create a teleportation device. And he successfully did it. And of course, he doesn't explain how he does it, but he put a little mice through it first. The doorway is a lot smaller. And the mice would come out the other side, and they'd be freezing cold, I believe is the way it worked, but they'd also be dead on the other side. I don't know if Stephen King is really notorious for ripping off other people's stories, but then he does a beautiful job retelling the story, so nobody slights him for it, right? If Twilight Zones didn't exist, you'd erase at least 1/3 of his catalog, and you'd erase probably 80% of his big sellers. But again, he does such a beautiful job, nobody busts his balls. But what he was suggesting in the short stories, I remember it, because the man who creates it eventually goes through the thing, and he comes through the other side, and I think he was much older on the other side, and they got about 5 seconds to ask him a question before he dropped dead. And his big question inside this story was that if man has a consciousness that is on a different plane of existence than the mortal coil that we have, if you move the mortal coil from point A to point B, do not take your soul with you. And your soul not being a religious soul, but just being the consciousness that is who you are, the symbiotic connection that you have. So we'd have to overlook the fact that if we did have a symbiotic relationship with our mortal coil, folding space would probably be right out of the game, unless somehow we fold the whole fabric of everything we're made out of to the other side. So let's just assume that that's what would happen. The problem that man has, I believe, is in the entire concept of space-time fabric. Space-time fabric is a methodology for us to discuss the fact that we are in XYZ position in space, and technically speaking, we're at a point in time, and because the state of the universe constantly changes, technically speaking, we're in a different point in time every split second of everything, right? Every divisible amount of change creates a new unit of time. And so Einstein creates the space-time fabric so we could understand how to perceive the universe more accurately. It doesn't mean that there's a space-time fabric in existence. There's not a quilt in space necessarily. Now, I believe that there is a fabric of all mass. I do believe that, and you can overlay time on it if that makes you feel better to measure its state changes. But if this is an interdimensional existence and these eyeballs are simply viewing time as a relative interpretation of what's going on, go see my time travel episode for massive details in this area. Then folding space, as Monty Python would say, is right out. You can't do it, Now, there's a bunch of theories around wormholes. And the idea is that the gravitational force of a wormhole, which is something that is usually in the fabric of all energy as you approach a black hole, which again probably doesn't exist, but there might be huge gravity well objects that aren't technically black holes, but do create this kind of rippling effect. The only time signature you would have inside of a wormhole would be that the state change is so compressed that time slows down, meaning the frequency of state change slows down. Still, super duper theoretical, and doesn't sound like anything that the human body or a spaceship could go through. Unless somehow, again, like Forbidden Planet, you modulate everything that is important to us, our ship's design, our bodies, our consciousness. Somehow you modulate it in a realm where we're using the gravity well of these objects to hurl us across space super fast and maybe so quickly that nothing touches us. Nothing disrupts our state change. So in terms of time, we actually take our, the amount of time that, it's 4.5 light years away to Alpha Centauri. So if we're traveling at light speeds, 4.5 years of state change in our bodies, right? If we're able to go warp 1. Well, the idea would be, if we could get to warp 100 and close that distance really, really fast, almost instantaneously, right? It's going 4.5 miles at 100 miles an hour, which is going to happen really, really quickly. It's still going to take a little while, but it's going to be very, very quick. Maybe we can get 1,000 miles an hour, 1,000 warp. We would have to figure out a way to, slow down after we gain all this speed. But, the idea is to keep our state the same, unaffected by the rest of the universe. And I'm not sure how you do that. How do you convince the fabric of all energy in the universe not to affect you? Is it possible to simply take a snapshot of who you are, move that snapshot to another location very, very quickly? I think that regardless of how you theorize folding space, you are essentially traveling the distance in between. You are. You're just doing it so quickly that your state change is irrelevant. It is so minute that maybe a millisecond goes by and you're at your destination. And then you slow down somehow. And again, slowing down we worry about on planet Earth, because if you're in a car and you slam on the brakes, you can throw your whole family into the dashboard, right? If there is no inertia pushing on you, because you've in some way modulated your energy to make inertia a zero factor in the equation, then there is no worry about you becoming splattered on the dashboard. You simply just stop relative to nothing, or at least relative to any type of opposite and equal reaction the other direction, right? In order to fold space, my only requirement would be we would need to know how to do what they did in Forbidden Planet. Modulate the ship itself and its occupants and all of the survival environmental systems that we use, the oxygen that we breathe, the molecules, every single atom that is important to us in getting to our destination, to the destination, and bring nothing with us in an altered state. Now, the other question is that you're going to have to move out of the way enough stuff that you can put your ship in that spot without creating a shockwave of sorts, right? There's been a lot of science fiction stories, and I believe some shows and movies on television and the big screen, where if an alien spaceship wanted to really disintegrate Earth, it would simply teleport itself to, like the mothership from Independence Day. If it were to be the size of New York City or Los Angeles, and it teleports down on top of Los Angeles, and then shockwaves, concussively shockwaves all of the atmosphere, it would all vaporize into pure energy, and we'd have a massive atomic bomb going across the entire, probably, circumference of the Earth. It'd be like a doomsday bomb, right? And they could just wipe out man just by even just taking an inanimate object and saying, we're going to clear off this planet, take the disk and teleport it down to the surface of the Earth, and that'll just wipe everything out. So we would have to make sure that we didn't, that we gracefully either took the mass that's at the location we're at and move it to where we are, and hope there's no implications of, you're taking the super virus from one world and moving it to the other world, taking a meteorite that's about to hit their planet and move it to Earth, and it slams into Earth. So you'd have to be careful about what you moved out of the way to make sure that you don't cause any ripples or shock waves to kill everything, right? I hope it's becoming evident how fun these conversations are, right? You're practically dealing with these things is really fun, and you don't have to be an astrophysicist to figure out all this stuff, to figure out some fairly decent kind of what we need theories here, right? There's the great reinterpretation of the movie Fly with Jeff Goldblum. And, they asked him one point, he has a female that he brings down to his laboratory right before he does the teleportation between one pod and the other, when the fly flies in with him and gets synthesized into his DNA, hence the movie. And I think it's a chick, but somebody asks him, how the hell did you build this thing? And he says, well, I know all these people in NASA, I know these people at these other, government contractors, and I simply ask for them to create one little part that solves one little problem. They don't know what I'm doing, bringing it all together. That's the genius of me. But I'm standing on the shoulder of giants as I bring all this stuff together. Which is ironic, because when he's in the movie Jurassic Park, that was his whole lament about chaos theory and standing on the shoulders of giants and not really respecting the entire process of what they were doing, right? They didn't study the ramifications of bringing back dinosaurs, which can't exist because there's too much gravitational force on Earth right now. But I think that what I've done here is just give a really kind of lowbrow interpretation of some of the basics that we'd have to get through if we couldn't simply just teleport from one place to another. If we were ever able to fold space, if we were ever able to map the universe a little bit using tachyon rays, right? Then a lot of what I just said would be irrelevant. We could immediately go to point A or point B from point A without having to worry about it, as long as we knew where the hell we were going, right? Now, there's a lot of you might be saying, well, it's, space is a vacuum, and we so know this already. Well, that is bunk, and NASA scientists at the very depths of the Mars mission back in the 80s knew that it wasn't a vacuum. They used to have these theories when I was a kid, and they'd say that, the distance between particles in space is so vast, that, there wouldn't be a problem moving from point A to point B because there's nothing there, Now, I would imagine that you could find very vacuous areas of space, but I would imagine that those vacuums would be, one, they'd have ether winds in them, which wouldn't be a huge problem. You may not be buying any celestial body for a very long journey. So finding the vacuum in space and teleporting to it might just put you in some serious peril to get to wherever the hell you're going, right? But it could be a mixture of warp speed versus impulse speed. You warp to these voids, and then you impulse in. Or maybe you just do warp 1. You actually do travel all the distance in between. So we get very close to Alpha Centauri with a warp jump, with maybe this hyperspacey kind of folding space jump, and then we just drive in. Who knows, right? But this episode's getting long, so I'm just going to end it right here. I hope you've enjoyed this little journey into how we might create our own UFO, right? Go bug some other people. Make them take Polaroid pictures of us. I do think that the United States of America and other countries may have created varying levels of anti-gravity machines. They may not be interstellar for all the reasons that we've dissected in this video, but I think that you just have to watch Back to the Future 2 to understand how horrendous the skies would be if everyone had an anti-gravity vehicle without serious artificial intelligence to make sure that 3D space up there didn't turn into this gigantic traffic accident in space, right? I'm assuming that we could figure that out, but don't put it past man to create anti-gravity before we create a guidance mechanism to make us travel wisely through space. There's a lot of UFOs that people believe are black ops vehicles, like the big triangles. A lot of helicopters chasing various vehicles or seeming to escort vehicles through the skies of the United States. At least there's people that have been fried by what appears to be electromagnetic fields way back in the 60s trying to drive home. And they have major physical ailments after they see these things, as if they were exposed to massive radiation, which could be just electromagnetism. Let's keep the conversation going. Get your notebooks out. Let's theorize about this stuff. I know there's some great videos about this stuff. If you guys can link them down below, it'd be awesome. Again, this book, I'll put a little picture of the book online so you guys can see what it is. It's kind of goofy, and I just read it for the first time about a month ago, maybe a couple months ago, and it was a little disappointing about how myopic this guy was. But I salute the guy's attempt to sort of bring something together. He's a little bit strung out on official stories, so he sort of limits himself a little bit, in my opinion. I think you feel me. So hope you enjoyed this. MKUltraRadio.com for all the feeds of all the deep thoughts. It'll get you to the YouTube channel if you're coming through a podcast. It'll get you to the podcast in case you want to listen to the episodes on your car or wherever the heck you are, jogging around. This is just an exercise in thinking open-mindedly about things that we've had utterly slammed shut in the universe. Again, take care of yourself and somebody else, and I'll see you in the next episode. Over now.